Hello, my name is Yongmie Jo and I'm a researcher currently based in South Korea. I'm here to share my current thoughts with you today about why respect and dignity are difficult to find in the current world, based on my academic work so far on the psychosocial conditions of people in poverty under modern capitalism. This talk doesn't focus particularly on the issue of poverty, but it discusses about the more general socio-relational condition of our time that is found under modern capitalism. As you may know, the steering principles of the Global People's Summit include values such as love, respect, dignity, belonging, togetherness, justice, equity, and so forth. And these are the kinds of values that determine the quality of our human relations in their essence, which deeply affect human well-being at its core. And the fact that the guiding principles chosen to build a new eco-social world are predominantly relational values demonstrates in itself that the quality of our current-day human relations needs substantial improvement. And while there are various kinds of relational deprivations that people face in the current world, what I'll be focusing on in this talk is the problem of lack of respect and undermining of human dignity between people that are reported worldwide. These problems have become very common around the world in both the modernized countries as well as the developing ones that are currently undergoing the modernization process. Prior to undertaking my own research, I found it quite odd that we frequently face this problem of society-wide lack of respect between people when the modern times in its principles is supposed to be the most equalizing in the way human value is perceived. But what we witness instead in reality is people's general struggles with low self-esteem and their strive for social recognition. And in order to move on to a world where no one is left behind, the first step would be to try and understand the reasons behind the current problems. So the aim of this talk is to share my research-based understandings on how a person's relational value is currently being identified in modern society, and how that subsequently results in the general scarcity of respect for the great majority of people, leading to the current strives and general struggles for recognition and restoration of human dignity. The analysis is mainly based on the case study of South Korea, which disclosed the more generalizable psychosocial dynamics that are operating under modern capitalism. So I believe the findings will be applicable to various other countries as well that either operates under modern capitalism or are undergoing the process of modernization and will be facing the same kinds of problems in time. Based on my research thus far, it seems likely that securing human dignity and respect for all members of our societies will become a major hurdle to overcome, if not the ultimate one, to significantly improving the quality of our human relations where no one is left behind. And this is because the necessary foundation for forming a quality human relationship, even between just two people, requires mutual respect. Being able to see that there is an equivalent level of human dignity in one another. And this is especially important for a democratic society that rests upon the participation of its members for its political and various other social processes, as social participation depends on the freedom of the people to stand before the others and to be able to freely connect with anyone in that society. Thus, it is also a basic necessity on a social level for a democratic society to ensure an equal sense of respect and dignity for all its members without exception. And as I will demonstrate in the following slides, to allow for everyone to share that equal sense of dignity and respect, human dignity needs to hold an absolute value and not a relative one. Although human dignity arguably holds an absolutist nature in its modern conception, what is found in reality is that human value and respect are being relatively attained in the current socio-relational environment under modern capitalism. And this kind of social condition is not very conducive to building and fostering quality relations between people, as genuine human connection necessitates that sense of equal relational value between people. Let's take the pre-modern Joseon Dynasty of Korea that lasted until the early 20th century as an illustration of how the members of society in pre-modern times identify the relational value and ethical level of respect that was to be paid to one another. In the Joseon Dynasty, every member of the society carried a clearly defined social status identity, mainly based on one's familial background. So depending on where one's family belonged within this social status system, the level of respect and socio-relational treatment one was to receive was mostly determined, with the king and the royal family being placed at the top for the most honorable and respected position. The aristocrats, called the Yangban, were to receive the second most respect as the major ruling class, usually occupying the top civil or military officer positions. And then came the upper middle class that usually worked in the lower rank jobs right below the Yangbans. The commoners were mainly composed of farmers, merchants, and fishermen, and the vulgar commoners were the lowest and the most disrespected status position in the society, who included servants, butchers, entertainers, shamans, and so on. So there were, roughly speaking, 4 main tiers for people in the level of respect that a person could pay and receive in pre-modern Korea. So, if you were to encounter this person here, under the pre-modern socio-relational system of Korea, the primary information you will look for to figure out who the person is to you and how to treat the person in an acceptable manner of the society would be the family background of the person, who the person's parents are, and who the grandparents are, or to whom the family members are married to, and so forth, which would speak for the major portion of the person's social status identity. So, what dictated people's social value and respectability as their social identities in pre-modern times was the relational affiliation that was collectively shared through familial ties, which included extended family members and even relatives that could be considered a part of this collective entity. On an individual level, a person's socio-relational identity was further specified based on the generational rank one held within the family group, and whether the person is a male or female, and then the age difference within the same generational rank, with the elderly always holding a more respected position than the younger person. So social respect in pre-modern Korea was largely predefined for people based on the socio-relational position that one was born into. And this left little or no room for a personal sense of inadequacy or shame to arise about one's relational value in the society. And the level of respect people received based on their predetermined status position was equally shared by many others in the society that belonged to the same status category. And as most people resided in largely settled agrarian communities in pre-modern Korea, there was much less frequent need as there is now for identifying people's socio-relational value, as their social identity usually stayed unchanged. Social respect could be significantly damaged in pre-modern times too, when failing to fulfill the social expectations that were associated with one's relational identity as a father, a mother, the first son, the daughter, and so forth. And the social rules and customs to abide by were dictated heavily by Confucianistic moral laws that acted as the main standard of values. It infiltrated into every aspect of people's lives in pre-modern Korea, and especially into the human relational realm. But overall, people's social identity and its relational value were pretty static in nature. Now, let's presume we encounter the same person but under the modern times. How would people figure out who the person is and the person's respectability in current-day South Korea? While there are still traces of pre-modern legacies in South Korea, its developmental process of modernization has continuously progressed towards an individualistic identification of people. And the dominant sources of socio-relational identification have become much more about individual level characteristics rather than collectivistic relational ties and family background. And thus, when socially identifying a person's relational value, people no longer care as much about the socio-relational value of one's parents or grandparents, And this tendency is also found in the relationship between men and women, with women's social identity becoming increasingly independent from that of their male partners. So here is an overview of the major changes that occurred in the socio-relational identification system with the shift to modern capitalism. Whereas in pre-modern times, everyone carried a clearly defined social identities that broadly determined the level of social respect one will receive and pay to the others, people's individualized identities in the modern times share a key nature of fundamental uncertainty. That is, it has become deeply uncertain for people who the others are in the same society, as well as who they are themselves to the others. And people's relational value and subsequent respectability have equally become unsure for people. And another major point to consider is the dominant social values that function as the general barometer for identifying the relational value of people in society. While Confucianistic moralism persists to a certain extent as the cultural tradition in South Korea, its dominant value system is found to have been largely replaced by capitalistic materialism. People no longer lose social respect based on their lack of Confucian values, such as failing to fulfill one's filial piety towards one's parents, for example, by not moving in with them to take care of them when they are in need in old age. Instead, relational value of people is now evaluated based on the material value they hold on an individual level. There is no absolute threshold for when a person's materially defined self-value reaches a respectable status. As for material values, there can always be a higher value position created with more wealth. Hence, in the current times, one's material value position always needs to be at least equivalent to or higher than that of the other individuals in order to be seen as a person of equal or positive relational value. So, what the research findings demonstrated about what happened in people's social relations with one another under modernization was not an absolute recognition of people's individualized relational values that would enable them to freely stand before one another and relate to anyone in that society. Instead, what surfaced as a general socio-relational condition has been one in which people now face each other as strangers by default, with a need to personally judge and evaluate one another's value for relational acceptance, with the self-based identity as the basic unit of evaluation. And because people's individualized self-identities are not perceived to hold an absolute value of equivalence, their varied relational values are independently identified based on their relative position to that of the others. And such value evaluation of people's social identity occurs every time one encounters another person that creates a specific relational context for that self-identification to occur. As materialism became the dominant value barometer, all kinds of individual level differences became the source of value identification of the self, with socio-economic disparity often acting as the primary determinant of one's self-value. This modern socio-relational identification process produces great instability for people regarding their independent relational value, as it is constantly open to change based on various individual level disparities. For instance, when a person's material value demonstrated through one's possession of a car or a house or clothing one wears in public is perceivably higher in value to that of another individual, the person's social identity attains a positive value from the relatively superior value position. And psychosocially speaking, this can incur a sense of pride over one's social identity and its relational value position within this specific relational context. But if the same person encounters another person demonstrating a higher material value, this time the person's relational value shifts to an inferior position in this other relational context. And this self-awareness can incur a sense of shame instead of pride about one's exact same material conditions. So the relational value of one's self-identity shifts every time the person faces a different person or the same person with various other comparable differences in material value, and also when material conditions change for either one involved within the specific relational context. And of course, the material value position of people itself is very sensitive to change under modern capitalism, and especially under the current economic environment where there is a higher level of instability in the material conditions of and disparities between people. As the level of urbanization continues to increase worldwide and the world becomes closer together through globalization and technological developments in communication and transportation systems, it is very likely that many more people around the world will be increasingly inhabiting a social environment where there is frequent exposure to various relational contexts with nearly an endless number of strangers who are uncertain in their social identity with multifaceted individual level disparities. And this identification process is inherently an incessant and a recurrent one that cannot be finalized, as it is a transient, materialistic, and relativistic evaluation of an ultimately uncertain and multifaceted entity of the self. And each individual person is always much more than the material conditions one is in. Essentially, people are in a state of relational estrangement from one another along the boundaries of their self-based identities, and this estrangement of the self lies from within each person. As people are also uncertain about the identity of their own selves, and an absolute recognition of human dignity is equally absent in most people's self-perception of themselves. Under this socio-relational condition of estrangement of the self, individual people have become the judge as well as the judged from within that extends to their everyday social relations. For instance, it is becoming an increasingly noticeable trend amongst the modernized countries to witness devaluation of individuals and ostracization of them from social relations, as we see in the social phenomenon such as cancel culture or individuals struggling with the feeling of being treated as a second-class citizen and facing socio-relational shaming when they find themselves to be economically less successful compared to the others. It is also a widespread social phenomenon nowadays that people struggle with insecurities about their self-value in society and in their human relations with one another. And as a response to this worldwide phenomena, international campaigns have been led in recent years by UN-affiliated organizations calling for self-love and for people to respect their own selves in relation to improving the mental well-being of people. These phenomena are found to be more evident among the younger generation in comparison to the older generation who grew up in a time where the pre-modern socio-relational identification was still persisting to a significant extent. So, compared to the pre-modern social status system, the overall socio-relational landscape of South Korea in the current times looks something more like this. Although not entirely, people have become much more atomized into self-based social entities which can vary a lot in their independent relational value even within a single family. And the socioeconomically defined top 1 to 10% of the population currently occupies a great chunk of the material resources that function as the primary source of value identification of people in Korean society. And with the general socio-relational condition of estrangement between people, the modern social status hierarchy and the general socio-relational landscape becomes one that is composed of numerous tiers that can be as many as the number of individuals in that society, including the top 1 to 10% of the population that are also increasingly atomized to an individual level. For example, in the case of high school students in South Korea, there are around 400,000 students in each year of the same age cohort, which means that there are as many as 400,000 possible social tiers now that exist for them to determine their social status position as an individual. And every one of those teenage children are now in competition against each other to race for who reaches the top tier before all else. Not every children stands at the same starting line, of course, so it isn't a fair game to begin with, yet the game has to be played nonetheless. The game doesn't end at any point in time either, as the self-identification process is an incessant one by nature, as mentioned earlier. In order to continue to identify a positive relational value of the self, everyone has to be climbing up faster than the speed of the one ahead of them. Yet, unless you maintain the very top position in this game somehow, you cannot be free from holding not only the higher position than the ones below you, but also the position of lower value than the ones above you. Hence, everyone except for the one individual that may be keeping the absolute top value position in this system finds one's value position in both prideful and shameful position, and even for students who manage to enter the top tier universities in South Korea are also found to face both pride and shame in the everyday social relations with one another, as do the students in the lower or the lowest ranking universities or those who do not enter at all. And this is a relational landscape faced by not only the high schoolers, but also faced by the grown-ups, where everyone finds oneself in any of these socioeconomic tiers made up of individual level material disparities and can attain both the positive and the negative value position of pride and shame, depending on who they are facing as the comparable other in each of their specific relational contexts. Also, depending on which specific source one focuses on to make that competitive value evaluation of oneself, the same person can hold multiple different value positions within the same society. And this creates an unavoidable socio-relational environment in which people become anxious about the constant shift in their relational value position, what the writer Alain de Botton has also pointed out and called the status anxiety. Now to summarize, the frequently reported undermining of human dignity and lack of respect found worldwide demonstrate at their core that despite the founding principles of modernity included equality and freedom of the individuals, the modern mode of socio-relational identification that is actually in place reveal inherent mechanisms that inevitably limit people's ability to attain an equal sense of dignity and relational value for respect, which in consequence limit their freedom to connect with anyone in society. The general socio-relational condition of the current times is one in which a fundamental sense of uncertainty introduced over individualized social entities of people brought about a relational state of estrangement not only between people, but also within people's personal sense of self. And the individualized relational values of people, now by default, are all put in an incessant re-evaluation and re-identification process. And people are now in an inherently competitive strive for the socio-relational acceptance of their human dignity, with individual level disparities and their relative superiority functioning as the source of value. The result is that people now find it difficult to see who we are ourselves and who the others are in the same society. People are unable to be seen for an absolute sense of dignity they carry as human beings, and instead, people are most often misread, misjudged, and their value as an individual human being is equated with the amount of material value they present in their visible living conditions or the numbers they carry in their bank account. And the relational estrangement from one another, as well as from our own selves, can never go away, even after succeeding to attain that relative superiority under the current mode of socio-relational identification, as the fundamental uncertainty itself remains the same that incessantly requires for transient proof of value. Moreover, the research findings also showed that what now functions as the basis of people's socio-relational connection is socioeconomically defined equivalence in people's relational value. But such socioeconomic equivalence is very difficult to attain even between just two people nowadays, due not only to the great inequality that exists between people, but also because of the complicated variations that exist in people's materially defined social status identities that have become very complex in its composition. And a sense of equality or proximity of the socioeconomic value of self-based identities would be both rare to find and nearly impossible to achieve in real terms. This creates a psychosocial environment in which a frequent intersection between pride and shame becomes unavoidable for most people, and the insecurity triggering great anxiety for people regarding their acceptability in society, both of which can undermine people's mental well-being as well as the quality of their human relations with one another. Lastly, I want to thank the organizing committee for allowing me this time and opportunity to share my thoughts with you today, and I look forward to hearing and learning about your own thoughts as well on this topic via the comment section, as I'm hoping to better understand the current reality myself and about what would be the necessary and the helpful means to consider for improving the current situation we're all in. The reference for this talk is as shown on this page, and this thesis will become available to be Googled and accessed online from later this year around November or so, for anyone who's interested. Thank you very much for your attention.